Hey everybody, welcome back to Dev Parkour. I'm Brian Parks, and in this video, I want to show you how you can run WordPress using Docker. Um, One of the reasons that I think this is really cool is because it makes it possible to do local development while still separating out the things that you might edit as a developer from the core WordPress install. And not only that, but any plugins you might be using, that sort of thing. So with that, let's switch over to demo mode and I'll show you what I'm looking at. So for this demo, we will use the WordPress official image from the Docker Hub. So you can see the page right here. There are a few different variations of this Docker image, but we'll use the latest. If you have a particular need to use a specific version of WordPress or on a specific version of PHP, so by default they recommend PHP 7.4. If you want to use PHP 8, you can do that. If you want to use PHP 7.3, you can do that as well. They also have a couple different ways that it'll run. By default, we'll just use the Apache version because that's 90%, I would say 90% of the time, but the vast majority of the time, that's probably what you're going to be running in production. So we'll just stick with PHP 7.4 Apache. And they recommend that you use, right, so they tell you all these configuration options, what you'd expect. Database host, database user, database password, database name, table prefix. This is all the stuff that when you go through and do a initial WordPress install and you don't have a WordPress config file, these are the things that it asks for. And if it can write to the WordPress directory, it'll save that config file. Otherwise, it'll give you the opportunity to download it and install it yourself. All the same stuff that you'd expect there. But what I recommend is actually using Docker Compose. The reason for this is that everything you need to configure is all right here. It means that the commands you use to spin up the Docker container, tear down the Docker container, is much simpler. And I even recommend this even if you don't want to run your database in a Docker container. In this video, we won't be using a database inside a Docker container, mainly because I already have MariaDB, which is MySQL compatible, running locally on my Windows machine. So I don't really want to run that natively on my machine and a copy inside a Docker container. That seems a little bit heavy. And also, as a WordPress developer, as a web developer, I frequently want to dive into the database and see what's going on. And in my case, I have HeidiSQL installed. It comes with MariaDB. It's a really great multiple database client. You can see I've got some Postgres connections here, a couple MySQL connections, but then my local MariaDB connection. So let's dive in there, and you can actually see that I've created a demo WordPress database already. Let's just go ahead and drop that so you can see what it looks like from the very beginning. Now at this point, if you want to develop locally from a WordPress site that exists already in production, what you should do is actually download a backup of that database and restore that backup into a new database here. But for right now, I'm just going to create a new database, and I am going to name it the same thing as I did before, WP demo. Hit OK, and you can see there it is, WP demo. It now exists. It has no tables, 0 bytes. So let's go over to Visual Studio Code and actually make it do some things. So you can see I've already kind of built out a little bit of a dev environment here. This is just enough that I started playing around with things to kind of prove out the concept and prep for this video. So the guts of everything is in this docker compose.yml file, and you'll see that the main parts of it are essentially what we saw on Docker Hub right here. So let's talk through some of these things. So right up at the top, you'll see version 3.1. That's necessary for Docker Compose. It just says what version of the spec we're using. I believe 3.1 is the latest. Next, we define our services. In our case, we're just going to have one service. It's going to be WordPress because we're not running the database inside a Docker container. So for that, we specify, sorry, my cat's jumping into the boxes I have around my desk if you hear noise. We're going to specify the image that we're going to use, which is going to be WordPress. Restart always just means bring it back up when the machine restarts. You can play around with that if that's not what you want. Ports means that, in this case, port 80 inside the container. So the container is running Apache, which by default listens on port 80, will actually be mapped to 8080 on the host machine. So you'll see in a minute when I spin this up that I'm actually going to go to localhost :8080 to get to the WordPress install. Then environment variables. And all of this stuff is basically what you saw mentioned, well, obviously here, but also in the how to use this image section. So WordPress DB host, WordPress DB user, and so on. So going back to Docker Compose file, we see DB host. Because I'm running MariaDB on my local machine, on the host machine, I need to use host.docker.internal. Host.docker.internal is a special name that always resolves to the IP address of your local machine. It's kind of magic that Docker provides so that you don't have to worry about knowing that IP address because obviously localhost won't work because inside the Docker container, localhost refers to the Docker container itself. It does not refer to your actual physical host. My laptop is not localhost within the Docker container. IP addresses might change. You can't necessarily trust the external IP address because, especially this being a laptop, I might go around to different Wi-Fi networks and get a different IP address. So host.docker.internal is what you want to use to be able to get back to your host machine. If you were using MariaDB or MySQL inside a container, you would use, in their case, they use DB, which is the name of the service provided there. So in this case, these two things have to match. And in their case, example user, example pass, example DB are the user, password, and database that they're setting when they create the DB container. In our case, because I'm running this locally, I created a WP demo database, which we'll see for WordPress DB name. And then for DB user and DB password, I'm using kind of my standard local development username and password. You've probably seen this username and password in other videos. This is just kind of my dummy username and password that I use locally. It's not super secure. I don't use this in production, and I highly recommend you don't use password as weak as this in production. Next up, we've got volumes. Volumes in Docker are a way to kind of encapsulate pieces of the file system, and in some cases map pieces of either the host file system or even other containers into the containers we're running here. So in this case, we actually have two different types of volumes. This one is one that Docker manages. It's a named volume indicated here. So at the bottom of the Docker Compose file, we give a list of named volumes. So Docker creates a named volume somewhere in the file system. We don't really care where it is. We never touch it, called WordPress, which basically means that even if this container gets destroyed and recreated, started and stopped, whatever, anything that's stored on that volume will persist between, even if we upgrade the container, if we decide we want to change the image that we're using, or if a new version of WordPress comes out and we need to rebuild this container, everything on this volume will stay the same. Which, to be honest, this container is built a little bit strangely, so I don't really know what'll happen if a new version of WordPress comes out and we rebuild the container. I'm really not sure if it will automatically upgrade WordPress or not, because this WordPress volume is mapped to var www.html, which is where WordPress lives. So basically what this container does is when it first spins up, it installs WordPress into var www.html, which the way we have it configured here, installs it to that volume, and then it does some initial configuration. So taking this into account, setting the the WordPress config file so that it can actually talk to the database. But you'll notice that I have another volume mapped here, and this one is not mentioned in the Docker Hub document here, right? The reason I did that is specifically because I want some aspects of my WordPress install to be pulled from my local development environment. So the most common thing that you're going to do with WordPress, especially to start out with, is you're going to build a custom theme. So what I did is I created a themes folder. I also created a plugins folder. Obviously, I have no plugins, but I created a themes folder, and in that, I created a new folder called My Custom Theme. This is the usual starting point for customizing WordPress, is creating a custom theme. And typically, you're actually going to make it a child theme of one of the themes you're already using. So in my case, I just pulled, you go ahead, do a Google search for how to build a WordPress custom theme. You'll find tons of articles on it. But basically, it's start with a style.css with this information. The most important thing is the theme name. And in order to make it a child theme, you add this final line at the bottom. Template 2021. So I'm saying that this is a child theme. That's what that template keyword means. And I'm specifying the theme that it is a child of. In this case, I'm choosing 2021. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So now let's actually use Docker Compose and run this. So again, Docker Compose file right here. We're in the this directory, so WP and Docker. That's my directory. Docker Compose is right at the root of that directory. So what I'm going to do is Docker Compose up, and this is PowerShell. So I am actually using PowerShell, even though Docker on Windows runs using Windows Subsystem for Linux, at least on Windows 10 Home, which is what I'm running here. I don't have to be in Windows Subsystem for Linux or at a bash terminal or anything like that in order to run this. I'm at my standard PowerShell terminal. So I'll do Docker Compose up, and it'll spin things up a little bit. We get a couple warnings, but basically what we see is that it spins up the Docker container with WordPress. And since I've run this already, it doesn't have to do the install to var www.html. The first time you run it, it'll probably take a little bit longer, and you'll see some messages talking about not finding a WordPress install, so installing WordPress. It found environment variables. So it'll create a new config and set everything up so that WordPress is ready to go. Now at this point, I can go back to my web browser and do localhost. And remember I said that we'd actually be going to port 8080. So let's go to port 8080, localhost port 8080, and we get an install screen. This makes sense because we're using a database that doesn't have anything in it. So let's choose English as the language, hit continue. Let's give this a site title, WordPress site. We'll create a password and let's do super secret password. Yep, okay, and put my email address in. Yep, that looks good. This checkbox doesn't really matter because we're running it locally on our machine. So search engines can't get to it anyway. We'll click install WordPress, and now everything's installed. And we can log in. What was it? Super secret password. Did I type that right? Hopefully I did. Now, because of the way I've set things up, there might be a slight performance issue because kind of the internals of the way Docker works on when it's using WSL is the file system that Docker uses is actually inside WSL. So what I'm doing is I've mounted a Windows file system into WSL, and then from there, Docker has mounted that, again, mounted file system into a Docker container. So it's kind of taking two hops. Might be a little bit of a performance issue, but shouldn't be too bad for development. There are other ways you can handle this if the performance gets too bad for you. But that's definitely a topic for another video. Okay, so we're into WordPress. Let's make sure that our theme got picked up. And there we go, it did. My custom theme alongside 2021, which is currently active, 2019, 2020. There really isn't anything here because going back to VS Code, we didn't do anything here. All it is a child theme of 2021. And if we were to activate it, it would look exactly like 2021. That's how child themes work. So with that, we have WordPress running in Docker. We have our custom theme directory mounted into Docker so we can actually see it in WordPress. And if we wanted to do the same thing for, let's say we were building a custom plugin for this site or extra custom themes, all we do is add new lines to this. We could do something like plugins / my fancy plugin. And then for the path inside the container for it to go, it would be var www HTML WP content, not themes, plugins, my fancy plugin. And then what you do is you can Control C and then Docker compose up again. If you don't want to have this log showing, you can just do Docker compose. I think it's start, and it'll start the container and then go into the background. Then when you're done, you can, well, in order to see the logs, you can do Docker compose logs, and I'll show you the most recent logs. You can -t to tail. No, what is it? -- tail. Docker. It might be Docker compose logs -- tail, probably -f. Yeah, there we go. I think with tail, you specify a number of lines you want to see. So you can docker compose logs -f to get the logs view and follow. And the hidden control C from that does not bring down the container. In order to bring down the container, you would do docker compose stop. And then when you're all done, you can just do docker compose down. And that will remove the container. That'll remove the network, which in this case is nothing. The network isn't doing anything because we don't have multiple containers that need to talk to each other. But what it won't do is it won't change anything locally on your disk, and it won't touch this volume here. So the next time you do docker compose up, it'll pull everything from this volume, and because we have this bind mount here, it'll pull my custom theme from this directory here. So with that, I think that's pretty much it. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and leave a comment down below. If you like this video, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button. That really helps. And also be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so that you can get notified when other videos like this get released. That is, it's free for you, but does a great deal for me. It means a lot for the channel, so please be sure to subscribe. And again, leave a comment down below, ask questions, give comments. If there's something that you do differently or maybe better, I'm not a WordPress developer day in, day out. So this was kind of new for me. So if there's something that you have as a recommendation for me and for other people, be sure to leave that as a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.